We're going to talk today about the content query web part in combination with the Microsoft Graph Toolkit, or MGT as you may know it. My name is David Warner with Catapult Systems on the PnP team, and with me is Hugo Bernier.
Hi, everybody.
So let's talk a little bit about the content query web part. This is a familiar web part going back to the days of classic on-prem. You can see this screenshot here is circa 2013. It was a very powerful web part. It had some degrees of shortcomings, things like it couldn't do cross-site connections to get your content, but it was pretty powerful in pulling in data from lists and libraries and allowing you to customize how that content was presented on the page. Now, you had to use things like XSL, which wasn't everyone's favorite. In fact, in many cases, people really didn't even know what XSL was. I remember talking to a group of developers and saying, how do you like XSL? And they say, I use Microsoft Excel all the time. So not even everyone really knew about XSL or how to use it. It was a little cumbersome, not the best to use. But in this new world of modern and the patterns and practices community, where the community builds things for everyone, we have the React Modern Content Query web part. With this being a community web part, we're constantly seeing improvements. And so we're going to show off some of those improvements today, things like being able to dive into information about a person column, getting additional info about that person in terms of like email or picture, information about the person metadata. Very powerful. But then we're going to see how we can combine that with the Microsoft Graph Toolkit. Hugo, tell us a little bit about the Microsoft Graph Toolkit.
Well, Betty just stole my script, but as you already heard, the Microsoft Graph Toolkit are reusable framework agnostic components, and they make it easy to access and work with the Microsoft Graph. And the Microsoft Graph, in case you don't know, is this bunch of APIs that allow you to access pretty much all your information about your Office 365 and Microsoft 365 data. So the components are fully functional right out of the box, but when they're embedded in the SharePoint web part, they handle things like authenticating and fetching the data from the Microsoft Graph. Now, the Microsoft Graph Toolkit, and I'll use MGT because it's faster to say that, makes it easy to use the Microsoft Graph in your web parts, but it usually requires you to edit your SharePoint framework code. Now, this session is not about coding. So what we wanted to do is we wanted to show you how we can combine a new feature of the content query web part with the Microsoft Graph Toolkit. And it will allow you to make calls to Microsoft Graph without writing any code. And this is a feature that's been requested a lot by users. They want to use the content query web part, but they want to be able to do things like showing information about people when they obviously don't want to have to duplicate that information in their SharePoint lists. So David's going to show you today how to combine the Microsoft Graph Toolkit and the content query web part. Back to you, David.
Thanks, Hugo. All right, so then let's dive in and take a look at how we can make this magical combination of a content query web part and the MGT come to life. I'm going to jump over to a browser, and let's set the context here for the content we're going to work with. Now, this is a simple list. We know that content query web parts pull content from our lists or libraries. So we have three very simple columns: contributor name, picture, and contributor. Now, contributor and contributor name appear to be somewhat identical, but this is actually a person column, right? These are actually person columns that are associated to user accounts within this tenancy. Now, in the days of Classic, when you had this list, there wasn't a lot of things you could do to it to make it look better out of the box, just within a list. We have that, though, in today's list formatting ecosystem. So we can do some nice degree of formatting. Chris shows us amazing, powerful ways to use list formatting all the time. But there is a ceiling, right? We're not going to get involved with JavaScript on a list formatting definition. We're going to have a degree of ceiling on what we're able to do to our list formatting experience. If we want to up the ante on that experience or that solution, we're usually going to want to include some degree of JavaScript, maybe custom HTML that's not allowed within a list formatting definition, and maybe some additional CSS that also isn't allowable within a list formatting definition, using things like pseudo attributes for hover, etc., things like that. So how can we make that work? Well, the Content Query Web Part gives us access to all that, but the beauty is we don't have to be SPFX developers. We don't have to feel like we're going to scaffold out a new SPFX web part, we're going to create a bunch of TypeScript, we're going to package it, deploy it. No, the Content Query Web Part gives us access through what's called handlebars, which is really nothing more than just HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. So let's take a look at how we can make that work using the Content Query Web Part. And we're really covering this as a basis for those that are not yet maybe familiar with the Content Query Web Part. If you are, some of this may be a little bit of review, but we know we have new ones in the community all the time coming to these calls. So I'm going to edit this page. It's just a basic page, and I'm going to look for my Content Query Web Part. I've got it right there, and now it's been added to the page. So we're going to configure it. And if you've used the Content Query Web Part in Classic, then you're familiar with things like defining the source, sorting and filtering. So we can do cross-site collection sourcing for our lists. In this case, I'm going to connect to a list here in my site collection called Community Contributors, the one we just saw the list formatting was based on. So we're pointing at that. I'm going to close that section. If I wanted to sort or filter, I could. This is also very familiar from the classic days of SharePoint and the original Content Query Web Part. We're able to take advantage of that by accessing this information right here. It should be very familiar, and it's very easy to use if it's not familiar. It's a very standard way of sorting and filtering. We can define the field upon which we would like to sort on, and we can define a filter as well as additional filters if we would like to do that as well. Powerful. And then we come in and we select the fields that we would like to have access to, right? So you used to have to do this in code for XSL or in the web part code behind, which was kind of a pain. Now we're able to see all of our fields. So we're going to scan through, we're going to grab that contributor field, and we see that the web part is auto updating for us as we select those fields. So we're going to come down and we've got contributor, and that's really all we need is contributor, but I'm going to add in picture, and I'm going to add in title just to show some comparison and contrasting. All right, so I've selected those. We see that information is showing up. For the picture, it's referencing some images on Twitter. For the title, it's really just a title. It's a plain text. And contributor looks to be identical to title. We see that there. They look to be identical, but they're really not, because remember, contributor is an actual person field. Now, I had mentioned that we have handlebars behind the scenes, and that's handled by the template, the handlebar template for our content. And you can access that directly here within the actual web part itself. We click that edit template content, brings up the template for us, and we can see here, like I mentioned, you don't have to be an SPFX developer at all. We're just talking about basic HTML. And we see here, if I zoom in, we can see it's referencing that information, contributor.textValue, picture.textValue, title.textValue, right? It's very repetitive, referencing the content of the fields that we've said we want to have included. But as I mentioned, there's been a lot of requests for that person field to give us access to more than just the text value. Out of the box, as of right now, or previous to today, I should say, it would give us access to just this text value. But we might want additional information about the person, things like email or picture or maybe display name like we see here, but in a more robust way. So if I hit save on this, we can see that it'll refresh. Everything's still the same. I'm going to go back in again just to show you how we can edit this and make changes on the fly. I'm going to remove those three cells. And I'm just going to paste in some content. We're not showing the typing of everything because we don't want you to get overwhelmed with feeling like you have to be a perfect developer to do this. What we've done, though, is we've changed contributor.textValue. That has gone bye-bye. And now we're referencing a new feature that's been added called person value, because it's a person field. And we can reference things like display name. All right, so I'm going to hit save, and we're going to see now it shows contributor and it shows display name. Not that much different, right? But I can also come back in and access additional information like the email address. Now, remember, we were seeing this before, but it was showing on individual columns. We would have had additional columns that show things like the picture or the email address. And so now that I've added contributor.personvalue.email, I can hit save, and bam, we see the email showing up. Now, this is a far cry This design here with this big orange box and just simple lists, it's a far cry from the design that we had within the Polaroids. We still want to see it get a little closer to that design because we do want to have a nice, robust experience for our users. Well, we have the ability to reference external handlebar templates. Now, this is no different really from what you see here. We have CSS and HTML inside of this dynamically generated template that's being done by the Content Query web part for us. That's great and fantastic. Maybe we don't really like working within this field, and certainly I think if anybody does any degree of development or changing and managing HTML or CSS, this is not the ideal way you'd want to do that. You may want to store it in an external location, which is what you can do right here. We can reference an external HTML file for our handlebar template. So we have one that's already been created using a basic look and feel. When I add that in, and again, we're not going to go into the details of this template. It's basic HTML. There's no smoke and mirrors here. It's nothing fancy. It's just HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. But now you can see it's changed that content, and it's using the exact same information that we've identified here, just in a greater degree of stylistic flair. And I have the ability now to do things like those hover pseudo attributes using CSS. We're using a filter to bring attention to the hovered contributor when we hover over them by going from black and white to color. So it's very powerful. But wait, there's more. What we've done here is we've said, okay, great, we're overwriting the default template to show a much better looking feel. You may have seen us showing this in other sessions. But what if we wanted to access a lot more information about the contributor, things that they're doing in the graph? Could you do that within this custom handlebar template? Yes, it's JavaScript, it's HTML, CSS, so you can write your own JavaScript to access it. But is there an easier way that doesn't require as much ongoing maintenance? Absolutely. The MGT is our friend. So now, if we go to mgt.dev, we're going to take a quick glimpse at some of the components that are available to you. Hugo, walk me through those.
Awesome. So there are a lot of Microsoft Graph Toolkit components, and they can all work with the Content Query web part. But the components that we'll use in our solution, because it just makes sense here, are the person and the person card. So you're seeing right now the person. The person component displays a person or contact by their photo, their name, and maybe their email address. Here you can see an example of that. And what we're looking at here, by the way, is something called the Microsoft Graph Toolkit Playground. So it allows you to actually test your Microsoft Graph Toolkit components before you even write it in your code. So here, this is something that automatically provides sample information. But obviously, if you sign in and you put it in your environment, it will be showing your actual information. Exactly. Thank you, David. Now, on the right side of that window, you can see this is the HTML code that you'd have to put in your web part or your solution if you wanted to display what you see on the left. And you can see here that it's got something called the person query attribute, which allows you to pass things like me to show information about me, or you can put an email address. So, and we'll come back to that shortly, but you could put an email address, or you can put a person's name to actually do a query, and it will actually find either, again, a person or a contact, and it'll do a query to the Microsoft Graph. And it'll render the information in a way that's, again, very consistent with the out-of-the-box SharePoint experience. Now, you can also change the layout between just showing an avatar image to an image and name, or an image, a name, and an email, which is what you see here. And you can do that by changing the view attribute. So if you don't specify, or for example, if you put one line, you'll see here that all we do is we show the person's image and the person's name, which is very consistent, again, with what you saw earlier on the SharePoint page. If you don't specify a view, the experience will be just the standard image without text. Now let's look at another component. If we look at the person card, the person card allows you to, what allows you to do is you can actually go to your MGT person component and add a attribute that says person card hover, and that's on the right side. And so what it allows you to do is when you mouse over, it'll actually show that rich person card that we're used to see in SharePoint and that we all love. And the great thing about this, and believe me, I've actually tried to rewrite this myself, and I have rewritten this myself. It's a lot of work to retrieve all the information that you need to see here. Thankfully, the Microsoft Graph Toolkit retrieves all this information for you and shows all that information. So now, and we could spend a bit more time if we wanted to explore the Microsoft Graph Toolkit person card, but for the purpose of this demo here, we're just going to stick to the person object. Now, the only thing that we're missing here is that we need, in order to display information about someone else, we need to have in the person query attribute, we need to have an email address. Now, it just so happens that what David just showed you is that in the content query web part, we can add, we can retrieve a contact or a person field, and we can retrieve their email address. So David, would you mind showing us how we can integrate that back into the content query web part?
Absolutely. Thank you, Hugo. So if we go back to our content query web part, I'm going to remove the custom URL to the template, and we're going to stick with the out-of-the-box template for now. We're going to show how even just using this included editor, we're able to access the MGT here within the web part itself. I'm going to remove, and our goal, of course, is to get a little closer to that Polaroid experience. So I'm going to remove that, and I'm going to paste in one of those MGT components. And instead of using me, as Hugo had mentioned, we're going to reference the contributor.personvalue.email, right? So now we're able to repeat, because remember, this template is getting repeated for each user that is referenced in that list. So being able to provide their personvalue.email is what gives us access to being able to pass that via the person query right here and know that the Graph Toolkit will go get the appropriate information. So let me hit save, but wait, what's going on? We're not seeing that image show up like we should expect as we saw in the playground. Why is that? Well, lo and behold, there's a nice new feature that's just been added to the content query web part called Microsoft Graph Toolkit support. And you can enable this. Now you may say, why are you providing the ability to enable it? Why don't you just enable it out of the box and include it with content query web part without us having to worry about it? Well, it's because it's including extra JavaScript that gives you that connection to the MGT, and you may not need that in every case. You may only need the original power of the content query web part, so you might not need to have access to the toolkit. And so giving you the ability to enable it allows you to remove any of the extra JavaScript that you might not need. So I'm going to enable it, and we see now my template information that I had included for the MGT person query has fired, and it's pulling back all that information about the users within our environment. Very, very cool. All right, let's go beyond that. What if we did want to use that person card? Because right now we're only showing the MGT person. We didn't include that person card. I'm going to replace that. We see what I've added is that person card click, right? And I'm going to hit save. And now it doesn't really look a lot different, but when I hover over it and I click, now I can actually get that information from MGT loading in that person card. I didn't have to write more than a line of code. Literally, a line of code gave me access to this information, a line of HTML. If I want to modify that a little bit more, and let's say we want to go from that 2 lines experience to 1 line, I can just change that there, hit save, and now we see 1 line. We see the picture has given us access to it. I can still click and see that information about April or Hugo or anyone else that is included here. Super cool, super powerful. Now, but wait, there's more. We're looking to try to get closer to the experience of our Polaroid solution. We want it to be rich and robust, a nice, appealing intro to our community contributors, but we still want to access that power of the graph. How can we combine those two things together? Well, the MGT provides templating, and we're not going to get too deep into templating here, but we're going to just quickly show you that templating experience here. I'm going to paste in some code, and we see that it's using a template. So I'm able to identify things like custom classes, right? And I'm going to hit save. And now we're getting a little closer. We have an image. We've wrapped a custom class around it. We maybe need to get rid of this little H3. So I'm going to go back in there and remove that so that it's getting a little bit closer to what we have. Okay, we're getting closer. And now I'm still able to access that information. I can click and see April. Now, what if I were to combine my custom template with that MGT reference that we see right here, right? What if I were to integrate that? Well, that's exactly what we've done right over here. This particular page is using a content query web part. And again, we're running a little short on time, but I want to show you the final experience. We see that I've got that ability to still show those Polaroid, and I can hover and I can click and I can see information about Hugo via the MGT. We can see that he does lots of SharePointy stuff. We know he's awesome for that, and we can see all that information. So very, very powerful. These are new features that are added to the content query web part. Let me go back to the slides and just wrap up. Here are some resources for you. Thank you all for your time today. Paolo, back to you.
Thank you, David, and thank you, Hugo. Super cool demo. As a developer, I'm speechless. Thank you so much. Great, great stuff.